In this video, we're going to complete the PowerPoint looking at how we set up the projects and deploy them, and then we're going to go ahead and do that in our container and see everything come into play and work together nicely. For our project setup, what we want to do is we want to first import World Manager Server Authentication.war. That's one of our resources. Import that into Eclipse so that we can look at the web XML directly. We can actually deploy the WAR file, which we'll do in a moment. So if you want to skip that step for now, you can and go right to the deploy. But what we can do is just take a look at this web XML as we go. So if you open it up in Eclipse, you can see this in the actual web XML. But here, I'm just listing it on the PowerPoint as well, where we have our security constraint section, which is going to be our main constraint area that we're going to assign the resources, the roles, the users that are going to be authorized, and essentially what pattern to protect. Our web resource collection is going to be named whatever we want to name it, so I'm just going to call it Access World Data. Our URL pattern, of course, is our protected URL, which we've seen in our filters, so this is very familiar to us at this point. And here we have HTTP method get and HTTP method post. Well, what this is doing is blocking the get and the post. So that means that there's put and delete, and there's some other ones out there that we could still do without authentication. So if you want to block them all, just leave it completely blank. Don't put any HTTP methods, and that will make sure that no matter what the method is, the user will have to authenticate. By listing them, you're only blocking those specific HTTP methods. But here we're just going to have that so that we can see get and post will definitely be blocked. And we're really only using get in our application anyway at this point. Outside of our web resource collection, then we have an authorization constraint. And this is where we're actually going to add in roles that we can use. So if you're in the admin role or the authorized user role, then we can actually say you can go ahead and use this page. Underneath that, we have two security roles that we're just going to list in the web XML so that the application has this information, admin and authorized user, which we're actually using in the authorization section that we saw before. And most importantly, we need a login config section to follow that, which tells us what type of login we're using. And here we're using basic authentication. Now, all basic authentication means is that the server is going to handle it. So when there's an authentication request required, the server will actually put up a form for us to log in, and then it will authenticate against the server itself. When we go to deploy, all we're going to do is grab that World Manager Server Authentication.war file, drop it into the Tomcat directory, giving all the permission, start the server, and we should see the server start up, and it will build a folder, and then we'll use a browser outside of Eclipse to view this. Now, I'll show you why in a moment here. That's going to wrap up our PowerPoint. We know that now we can do basic authentication through the server. We can link our users and roles via the web XML, and so those have to be configured on both the server and in the application. And all applications on the domain have access to the same roles and users. So we don't have the ability at this point to separate multiple applications from having access through these different types of user password combinations unless we create a bunch of different roles and make them app specific. And then we start to get into a real configuration nightmare once you have multiple applications running on your server. Next thing we want to do is import our project into the Eclipse environment. And what we'll see is that we have the World Manager Server Authentication project. We still have list cities and list countries. And we have our web XML file, which is where we really want to look at. And I've made this page a little nicer. I took out the filters at this point. I've taken out the custom tags. It's a lighter weight. It has everything that we need to go forward. And the navigation is much easier to handle. What I've done for that is I've basically used parameters. I can test the context path and determine if that allows me to go into a specific default place or if I need to actually just replace with the base URL. And so this way, every page can use the same navigation schema and not have to worry about where it's at relative to the actual URL. But with that, let's look at the web XML. At the bottom of our web XML here, I've included, after our welcome file list, a security constraint section, just like we saw in the PowerPoint, but here you can see it in the web XML. Containing access world data. Protected namespace is the protected directory / star, so any files in protected. And there we have our get and post named. Again, if you took those out, you should get blocked on all methods, not just get and post. Here's our auth constraint where we're going to allow both roles, admin and authorized user in. And of course, if we have some admin sections later, we can create another one that has a more detailed section for protected / admin with just only the admin, etc. So you can see there is configuration levels that we can do. Here's our security roles. So those are just the roles mapping that we have them. And the login config, which is basically going to set up our authentication method to be basic. So if you try to run this in Eclipse, what you'll find is that it won't work. It will work up until the point we have to authenticate. At that point, Eclipse has deployed it in a way that it doesn't necessarily communicate nicely with our container. There may be ways to configure that within Eclipse, but it's really not necessary beyond the scope of what we need to study here, so I'm going to go ahead and avoid doing that. But if you wanted to spend some time researching that, by all means, you could try to do that. But I want to point out that even if I'm logged in here to the application with a valid login that I've created for the application, that's not the same thing as logging into the server at this point. So I'm logged in, but if I try to view the cities, the server's still going to request that I do something. So here I can try to admin with my credentials, and I can say OK, and it will ask me over and over again, even though I know for a fact that I'm typing the correct credentials 3 times in, it will basically stop and tell me that I'm not authenticated. So what I need to do is actually run this in the container to see that basic authentication in action. So I have my World Manager server Authentication.war file from our resources. I'm just going to copy it into my Tomcat directory and give it permission under the web apps area of my Tomcat container. So once I have that, my application is set up for deployment. I'm going to go ahead and start this. And once again, if it starts correctly, it should continue to run. And you will see an application folder created, which you can examine, having our pages, having our web XML in that information, and any of our classes that are under here. They're all there. So we can actually see all that got deployed for us automatically. And what we need to do is just browse to it outside of Eclipse. So here we have the Internet Explorer browser. Go ahead and log in again. Once again, I'm going to log in from the server, make sure my cookies remember me. And then I'll say View Cities. And once again, it says you're still not authorized on the server. Here I'm going to log in as my admin with my password. It's not letting me log in, and I know why. I forgot to turn off my Eclipse server. So now I have to stop this. So we'll go ahead and just close out the whole browser. Let's go back into Eclipse and go to my server here and make sure that it's not started. Stop it there. Now my server stopped in Eclipse, and now what I want to do is go ahead and restart my server here. That was what was happening. The Eclipse version was still locking out the server. Now let's try this. And what we'll do once again is make sure we're logged in. And then we'll go ahead and try to log in to the server. And there, it lets me through. So now I'm through because I've authenticated through the server correctly, and everything is in place. I want to point out that even if I log out of the application, I'm still logged into the server. So that hasn't logged me out of the server. Once I restart my browser, once again, I'll require different authentication. So once again, it lets me back in. And that wraps up our look at server-side authentication and basic authentication through the server.